Okay, well, good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to see you all here tonight and availing yourselves of our wonderful air conditioning, which we need. And I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Robert Arnott, who's here to launch his book, Crossing Continents Between India and the Aegean, from Prehistory to Alexander the Great. Professor Robert Arnott, formerly of the University of Birmingham, is now a fellow of Green Templeton College, the University of Oxford. He's an archaeologist, and he's excavated through the Eastern Mediterranean. He's been the author or editor of 5 books and over 80 papers, and he's an authority on disease and medicine in the Aegean and the Anatolian Bronze Age, 2000 to 1100 BCE. In recent years, his interest, I'm just letting somebody in, his interest has turned to India, where he's visited very frequently for his work in modern global health, and his latest publications have concentrated on health, disease, and medicine in the Indus Civilization, and on its distant and tenuous relationship with Greece and the Aegean from prehistory to the time of Alexander the Great. And I should also say here that he is a fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society, so we're very pleased to have you here tonight. And I'm sorry you were not able to be here in person, which we had planned, because unfortunately Professor Arnott caught COVID, but you're feeling all right now, I hope. Yes, okay, good. Right, well, I'm just going to hand it to you, and I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alison, for those kind words. After many rewarding years working as an archaeologist in Greece and the Aegean, I first visited India some 18 years ago, working with a global health team, tending to the needs of the poorest population of the Indian state. Oops. Oh dear, a good start. Here we go. Working in the population of the Indian state of Punjab. Many weeks of the year spent in India led me to take an interest in its archaeology, especially its spectacular Bronze Age, the Indus Civilization. Unsurprisingly, it led me to thinking about its contacts between the Eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean at this time. It also prompted me to re-examine the evidence and came to the firm conclusion that there was growing contact dated to the late 3rd and early 2nd millennia BCE between the Indus Civilization, the Near East, and finally westwards through Syria towards the slowing emergent societies of the early and middle Bronze Age Aegean, later to develop into their palace-based economies and complex social structures. From the Indus heartlands to the prehistoric Aegean, at the distance of 6,500 kilometers, objects and commodities were on the move within what has been described as a pre-industrial world system, where, far from being a barrier to contact, the sea was a great highway. This means of exchange and communications were part of an interregional pattern of 3rd millennium proto-urbanization that encompassed the lands from the Mediterranean Sea, east across the Iranian plateau to India, Central Asia, and some say China. What I want to do, firstly, is to discuss within the context of contacts between India and the Aegean in prehistory through trade and contact conducted by merchants of the Near East and Syria, either by way of the Gulf Sea route or overland through northern Iran. The question remains as to whether at the very western extremity of this pattern of contact, those who lived in the Aegean knew anything of the origins of the objects and commodities that originated in India, but thought of them simply as from the East. As you know, the Indus Civilization was in size by far the most extensive urban Bronze Age civilization of its time, covering over 700,000 square kilometers, increasing to 1.5 million square kilometers if one includes the periphery from Kashmir to the north to Gujarat in the south, but with its influence extending well beyond its northern border to Afghanistan and Tajikistan, and as far west as the Gulf and Mesopotamia. During the mature Harappan phase, which lasted from approximately 2600 to 1900 BCE, the civilization supported over 1,000 settlements, ranging from village farming communities and small towns up to several fully developed and wealthy urban centers or cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, with populations of tens of thousands and an estimated population of the whole civilization of something like over 5 million. The rapid appearance of the mature Harappan phase of the Indus Civilization was originally thought to be the result of cultural diffusion from the Near East. This has now been discredited by the discovery of a structured subsistence economy and proto-urbanization in the pre and early Harappan phases in the 5th to 3rd millennia BCE, which developed directly from the Aceramic Neolithic that began in the 7th millennium BCE in such centers as Meluḥħa, and shows a slow and indigenous development of their society and cultures. Many of the Indus Civilization buildings, particularly at Mohenjo-daro, as you can see in the slide, were made from high quality fired bricks, and there is evidence of warehouses, massive city walls and gateways, a highly advanced fresh water supply and public health infrastructure, and extensive areas for craft and industrial production. The rural subsistence economy consisted of food production dominated by pastoral farming, plus what is believed to be a rural textile industry. Supplying the demand for raw materials, food and finished products requires a sophisticated system that integrated the widely dispersed settlements. Many of the specialist craft products in here became standardized and widely distributed throughout the region. Close similarities in pottery, brick sizes, and particularly seals. This one here, other one here, seals. I particularly like the one on the left. We have tigers. Shows strong evidence for a shared Indus ideology, and the Indus script, albeit still undeciphered, proves a level of literacy and suggests the existence of some form of administrative system to oversee the economy, food production, and possibly public health. It is believed that the Indus civilization is also very different from other contemporary societies, as it is believed to be a rare example of an early egalitarian prehistoric state, which seemingly developed without any strong and centralized social control, elites, or evidence of structural violence, except at its very end. For the Indus civilization, trade with the Near East and towards the West was for export of those objects and commodities for which they produced or had control, which we believe included gold, tin, timber, elephant ivory, carnelian, and agate beads, lapis lazuli, and some other semi-specialist stones. We also believe that they included silk, dyes, colored cotton garments, high quality cotton yarn, and leather. They reached Mesopotamia from India overland or by sea through the Gulf. With some trade farther westwards, conducted by a third party along the upper reaches of the river Euphrates and the city of Mari, and then into the Eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean. It is possible to trace the start of the arrival of occasional objects from India into the Aegean from the Near East to around 2300 BCE, when infrequent and attenuated long-distance links would have had more of a social impact than the number of objects and commodities. In the Aegean, they would also have been viewed as exotica. For commodities in much greater supply, we can trace these back to the first use of tin in approximately 2100 BCE. What is all of particular significance is that a standardized weight system with identifiable multiples and fractions of units was first evident in the 3rd millennium BCE. They may have had the same source with the Indus Civilization, Mesopotamia, and the Aegean, together with Egypt, with Syria, sharing a close communality between the system of weights and measures, based on an intent to facilitate relatively easy interconversion. The emergence of the metals trade must have been the driving force behind the creation of this common weight system, particularly for the areas that metals were becoming, as metals becoming central mediators of value. Although no distinctive Indus cubic weights, examples here, have been found in the Aegean, a number of Near Eastern weights have been found both there and in India, and some Indus Civilization weights have been found in Mesopotamia. By 2500 BC at the earliest, a common system had emerged from the three civilizations. Therefore, it is no coincidence that we now see some structured trade in valuable commodities common to all three societies. What is interesting is it does not include Egypt. Recent research now sheds new light on the question of contacts between India and the Aegean. It is based on the movement of objects and commodities for which we now have evidence. It shows what we call trickle-down contact between the Aegean and India in prehistory, and we can in fact place this contact and trade into three distinct categories. One, the importation of objects manufactured in India or from Indian commodities exported to the Near East, which eventually found their way to the Aegean at the end of the 3rd and the beginning of the 2nd millennia, and have parallels at Indian civilization sites. Two, the importation of inorganic commodities such as tin, lapis lazuli, and possibly some gold, exported in the 3rd and early 2nd millennia from under Indus Civilization control. And thirdly, the importation of non-perishable organic commodities. I emphasize all three are what I should call anonymous contact, and I stress again that they do not testify to direct cultural and trade links and geographical knowledge between the Indus civilization and the Aegean. It was just the natural extension of trade and contacts between India and the Near East. No goods or commodities arrived directly from India. They first accumulated added value in the Near East and Syria. Although the Indus civilization will, however, have appreciated the economic benefits of this trade, it was of little importance to the evolution of their cultural complexity and identity. What it does do is to suggest that what the Indus civilization produced or sourced had a special value thousands of kilometers away. Now I now turn to examining my evidence based on the three categories I have outlined. My first category is the importation of objects manufactured in India or from Indian commodities exported to the Near East, which eventually found their way to the Aegean. I shall, however, first dispose of some negative evidence. Several scholars in the past have tried to bring together what they believe to be indications of relations between the Aegean and India, but their ideas are not supported by any hard evidence. Biampandi proposed an Indus Civilization Aegean link through the distribution of pottery kernoi or cluster vases. He described 4 examples from Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. What's going on here? There we go. Oh, no, it's stuck. And Mohenjo-daro discovered in mature Harappan phase contexts. Kernoi in all their form have a remarkably wide distribution from the 4th to the 2nd millennia BCE, including the Aegean, Cyprus, Syria, and Mesopotamia. In the Aegean, where they are first found in around 22,100 BC, they tend to be far more elaborate and ornate. So on balance, it is unlikely that there was any connection with the Aegean and the Indus civilization's kernoi. Another area that some have suggested shows contact is the distribution of spiral double-headed pins. Seen here. Stuart Pigott first suggested that these bronze and copper pins found at Indus civilization sites originated in Central Asia and had connections westwards in Anatolia, the Aegean, and the Balkans. Indus civilization examples are of a type that resemble at first glance those from the Balkans and are similar to the bronze, silver, or gold examples dated to the Aegean early Bronze Age, no later than 2300 BC, as seen on the slide here. Numerous examples also come from Anatolia and Iran and are similarly dated. Pigott tried to find a movement of them both eastwards and westwards over the succeeding centuries from Central Asia up to the time of the Indian finds, and were then dated to the late Harappan phase in approximately 1800 BCE. However, proposing an Indus Aegean or any other connection between these pins has, I believe, no real meaning, chronologically or otherwise. On closer examination, they have quite major differences, particularly in the metal from which they were made, in the thickness of their shafts, and generally in overall appearance, and are likely to be a local invention. No evidence, therefore, points to the form originating outside the particular region. Now, this is the interesting one. I like this. There's even been a suggestion that what some have described as Indus civilization bull leaping had an effect on Minoan bull leaping some 600 to 700 years later. However, this is really rather fanciful. I shall now look at carnelian beads, which produces our first most important positive evidence of the importation into the Aegean of objects manufactured in India. Distribution over the extensive trade routes that emanated from the Indus Valley to Central Asia, Iran and the Gulf, Mesopotamia and the Aegean. And the chart showing, I hope you can read it, of indication of places where these beads have been found. Carnelian beads, particularly the etched variety, were considered both rare and exotic. The etching of beads originally solely in India, and as they are quite distinctive and cannot be confused with those made elsewhere, except if they are made in Mesopotamia, but only then by emigre Indus craftsmen. The discovery in the year 2000 of a jewelry and precious object hoard hidden away under House 19 of the fortified coastal settlement of Colonna on the Aegean island of Aegina in the Saronic Gulf of Greece by a team from the University of Salzburg, known as the Aegean Hoard, included 19 red carnelian beads, one etched with 3 groups of twin white on red concentric circles and one elongated type. And on top of that, 18 others, all Indian, were found as well. The beads are to be dated to the early Helladic II period, or 2300 BCE, albeit found in a slightly later early Helladic III context, possibly hidden from intruders at that time. It is interesting that similar beads are still being made at the site of Kambat in Western India. Other carnelian beads, many of the elongated form and of the same period, have been found in the early Bronze Age cemetery of Meluḥħa in eastern Crete, dated to 2200 BC. In the settlement of Descalio and the cemetery of Kavos on the Cycalic island of Tyros. From Troy in Schliemann's treasure E and L, Polyochnion Lemnos, and Anzaguriez on the Greek mainland. All contemporary with and dating to 2200 BCE. The carnelian beads that have been found in the Aegean in the early Bronze Age, such as those from Colonna, will definitively have originated in India, where the exports of such beads were at that height during the mature Harappan phase, and from where there are many parallels. In the Indus Civilization, the etched carnelian beads was a popular type in use throughout the period, and very close parallels of the Colonna bead can be found in both Chanudaro and Mohenjo-daro, consistent in date to 2400 to 2300 BCE. They could not have been made anywhere else other than, as I say, by Indus emigre craftsmen in Mesopotamia, but using carnelian imported from India. Finally, as far as the Colonna beads in general are concerned, we are reminded that Aegean played a very important role in what can only be described as an Anatolian trade network linking Mesopotamia, the overland routes of Anatolia, Mari, and the east with the Saronic Gulf, thriving independent from anything that was happening at the time on Crete. Regarding agate, it has been suggested that, as with carnelian, while supporting an Indian origin for the agate used in the Aegean for making seals, that some of the material was imported into the region in the 3rd millennium BC as finished beads and then reworked. For example, 3 agate beads from the New Palace workshop at Thebes, dating from the late Bronze Age, are now thought to have been made from cut down Indus agate beads, as is this late Bronze Age example from Armeni in Western Crete, in a site where I currently am working. Within the same hoard found on Colonna and Aegian as the carnelian beads were 3 silver flat disc-shaped beads that's one of them, with a tubular perforation in a raised central midriff of a type very well known to both the Aegean and the Indus civilization. There are good Aegean parallels in gold from Troy 2G. As well as from Mesopotamia and the early dynastic Akkadian sites dated around 2300 BCE. They are also found at sites all along the northerly land and Gulf trade routes and in India, they have been found at Mohenjo-daro. Examples are of local manufacture in gold, and these are part of these necklaces. A similar necklace, also made with gold beads, comes from Lothal in the Gujarat, which may be significant in terms of it being found at a surviving center for trade with the West. For the silver beads from Aegian and other sites where carnelian beads have also been found, a similar path of trade and contact is very likely, with the distribution of beads or their design stretching from the Aegean to India, with them being passed from one center to another along this route, perhaps following the trade in commodities. What it does not prove, however, is that the Aegean examples were necessarily made in India. A steatite jeweler's mold from Mari of an early dynastic III date includes a hollow for the manufacturing of this type of bead, and the colonial examples are made from silver, unlike most of the others that are made from gold. The fact that they could have been produced in India, the Near East, Iran, Central Asia, or the Eastern Mediterranean is possible, but what they offer is the distribution of these beads as a strong evidence for the existence of Aegean links with Asia Minor, Iran, and India. As for other beads, I shall finally and briefly look at faience segmented beads. The arrow there, of which several white and red or white and brown examples have been found, mostly in later levels at Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. Identical examples of pale blue and green in color have also been uncovered in the temple repositories at Knossos, dating to the early part of the Middle Bronze Age, approximately 1700 BCE. Spectrographic analysis has shown that two of the segmented beads, one from Knossos and another from Harappa, are identical in manufacture and composition and dated to approximately the same time at the end of the late Harappan phase. It is likely that the Knossos and Indus faience segmented beads are not only contemporary, but are likely from the same source and offers further evidence of indirect contact through prestige jewelry items at the time when the Indus civilization is in its post-urban period, but when there was still enough impetus between the economy to sustain long-distance trade. We also know that beads as small as these can be easily transported over very long distances. I now turn to my second category, the importation of inorganic commodities exported in the third and early second millennia under Indus civilization control. To trace the movement and importation of these commodities from India to the Aegean, it is again necessary to first find their place in the archaeological and textual record of the Near East. You see the trade in raw materials and their networks on this slide. We're reminded of several Akkadian tablets mentioning Meluḥħa, now known to be India, bringing to their shores inorganic commodities that included, amongst other things, carnelian, lapis lazuli, and metals such as copper, tin, and gold. Some of these commodities would eventually have found their way to the Eastern Mediterranean, including the Aegean. Determining the route by which commodities would be shipped westwards, either by sea or land, would have been an important consideration for merchants. It can be argued that long-distance trade, such as in tin and perhaps cotton, leather, and other bulkier or heavier items, may have been considered uneconomic and time-consuming to be conducted over land. With advances in technology, navigation, and organization, sea transport would have been far more profitable. Some commodity shipments, however, passed westwards directly from their source in northwest Afghanistan through the Indus Civilization settlement at Chortjugai. You see it there, far in the north in Afghanistan. But under Harappan control. By the time of the emergence of the major urban centers in the late 4th millennium BC in India and the Near East, there was significant demand in both civilizations for high-value commodities for them to be resourced over vast distances. One such material was lapis lazuli. That's a raw block there. The use of making beads, cylinder seals, amulets as inlay, and much else. The consumption of this elite commodity was driven by its value brought about by the distance of trade and the difficulty of access to its place of origin. We know that evidence points to the major natural and exploited source to be in the seams of lapis lazuli above a place called Sarisang, located by the Kotra River at the confluence with the river Oxus in Bangladestan, in the Hindu Kush mountains of modern northeast Afghanistan, and very hazardous to extract. Although routes out of the area were neither direct nor easy, lapis lazuli began arriving in the Near East between 3,800 and 3,500 BCE. Towards the end of this period, we now see in Mesopotamia the need to acquire it in much larger quantities, which led to even greater demand. The main concentration of worked lapis lazuli is to be found in Mesopotamia. Although we do have its use also in Egypt, which is, see there, which is the only aspect of the trade in which the Egyptians participated. In India, the first use of lapis lazuli was reported from around 4,300 to 3,300 BCE. Later, however, during the mature Harappan phase, it appears that it was not much used locally for personal adornment or for making seals, because it is believed that it would have been far more lucrative to export the material to markets in the West than to retain it in any quantity for local use. It is possible, however, that lapis lazuli did not have the same symbolic value for the population of the Indus as it did in Mesopotamia. The export from the source of lapis lazuli at Sarisang in Central Asia takes different patterns in two successive periods. In the earlier period, at Shahi Sokhta, located in eastern Iran, between 2,600 to 2,450 BC, there was a major working center in lapis lazuli, both for local consumption and export, particularly for the preparation of raw material, such as the removal of impurities for export to places such as Mesopotamia, not for the manufacturing of objects. In the second period after 2450 BCE, processing in Iran seems to have ceased, and ores were now being taken directly to the Indus Civilization heartland from Central Asia for working and export. The Indus Civilization now controlled the procurement of and trade in lapis lazuli, primarily intended for export to the markets in Mesopotamia and beyond. Its exportation further westwards from India into the Eastern Mediterranean continued spasmodically into the late Bronze Age, but as one suspects, with a great deal of use of the material from much earlier imports. Unlike the Near East, in the Aegean, lapis lazuli was not imported in any huge quantities. Of the surviving examples, there are, for example, little over 18 Minoan seals made from the material, 5 of which are enhanced by gold mountings, which can be dated to around 1850 BCE. However, some of these are spotted with white calcite inclusions, which are of lesser quality. Lapis lazuli was used in rings and beads found in the earlier Aegean treasure, which shows distinct Minoan influences, if not manufacture. However, in the Aegean, it is likely that some of the objects were recycled imports. It's not thought that any objects of lapis lazuli were manufactured in India in any period. During the late Bronze Age, in the Aegean, well after the end of the Indus Civilization, there is evidence that the material continued to be imported from India through North Syrian traders, who would have supplied it to the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean. From Afghanistan to Mesopotamia, it was now likely transported by land over the Zagros Mountains, and then from Kassite Babylon westwards through Syria, and then some to Egypt, where it is chronicled in the Amarna letters dating to the mid-14th century BC. Of the use of lapis lazuli in the late Bronze Age in the Aegean, like earlier periods, it, as I mentioned, is already relatively rare. Examples include a cache of 33 lapis lazuli cylinder seals, many of the later ones reworked in a context dating slightly earlier to the late Bronze Age, or approximately 1300 BCE, within the treasure room of the later palace at Thebes in Meluḥħa, which includes 7 heirloom seals of various Mesopotamian styles dating to the late Dynastic III or the Old Babylonian periods around the start of the 2nd millennium BCE, and 12 Kassite seals from Babylon. That's one example, dated to the mid-13th century BC, of which 17 are made from lapis lazuli, the early ones made at a time when the Indus Civilization controlled the trade in the material. The question arises as to whether the Aegean could have imported any gold that originated in India or areas under control of the Indus Civilization. There's clearly a lack of clear evidence for the source of gold within the Aegean, and this has led to most scholars seeking that source outside the region, especially when one has in mind the quality of gold found, for example, in Shaft Grave Circle 8 at Mycenae, dated to around 1600 BCE. It has long been thought that this and other gold originated in Egypt or possibly Anatolia or the Balkans. The basic answer to the question is we just do not know. On this basis, we cannot rule out India as a possible source of at least some of the gold in use, especially in earlier prehistory. The sources of gold in India from the period of the Indus Civilization are well known. Some was obtained by panning from the sands of the upper Indus River or its tributaries. Another alluvial source was from the river Kocha, located near to where tin and lapis lazuli was obtained. Like the Aegean, the evidence of the source of gold in Mesopotamia itself is also obscure and imprecise. At the Lagash, gold has a special connection with Meluḥħa, or India, where on cuneiform texts we see reference to gold in the dust coming from that location, and the trade with the Gulf producing gold that was reaching Ur. There is good reason to suppose that at least some gold in the Aegean may have originated in India, having made the long and tortuous journey westwards. The earliest evidence for the use of gold in the Aegean appears, for example, at the site I've mentioned earlier, Meluḥħa, in approximately 2300 BC. All objects appear to have been made locally with it on Crete, but the gold being imported as a commodity. What is of interest is that the carnelian bead from Meluḥħa was also found in tomb 19, which had clear Indus Civilization links. And now to tin, most important. In the latter part of the 3rd millennium BCE, tin was in use in several early Bronze Age societies for the making of tin bronze, including the Indus Civilization, for the Aegean and the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean. From its first need, adequate local sources of tin were either non-existent. So this meant that the trade routes that extended eastwards beyond Mesopotamia, Iran and the Gulf to the Indus Civilization at the time would have been partly created by the search for the supply of this immensely valuable commodity. For the Indus Civilization, metallurgical technology first developed in the 4th millennium BCE, and the first use of tin bronzes brought an appreciation and the importance of tin, not only locally, but as a highly valued export commodity. The location of the sources of tin in the Near East, in the early Bronze Age, has been subject to considerable debate, but evidence now points again to the source in northeastern Afghanistan. Under Indus Civilization control, which was to come by the end of the 2nd millennium, a major source for the Near East, Anatolia and the Eastern Mediterranean. Here it is being sourced in its natural pre-smelted form from alluvial deposits of cassiterite and then taken to the Indus heartland for re-exportation westwards, mostly by sea, or some exported directly overland from its source, but like lapis lazuli, under Indus Civilization control. We have a text from the time of King Gudea in Lagash in Mesopotamia, who reigned from 2150 to 2111, which refers to the importation of copper, likely sourced in the Gulf, tin presumably for making bronze, and lapis lazuli from Meluḥħa in the region. The text from a clay cylinder seal reads, "Copper and tin, blocks of lapis lazuli, bright carnelian from the land of Meluḥħa." The metalworks in Sumer seemingly did not alloy the copper and tin to make bronze for their own use, but it's suspected that tin from India moved westwards as pure ingots, possibly bun ingots, having been smelted in situ in India to enhance its value as a commodity. Tin for the Indus Civilization, like lapis lazuli, was for export. Textual evidence also points to the city of Tepe in central Anatolia and other cities of North Syria and Cilicia, beginning in around 2000 BCE, now opening up into a period of intense commercial activity, trading in metals such as gold, silver, and particularly tin. After the decline of the Indus Civilization, the sources in Afghanistan would have continued to be exploited for tin, carrying the resources westwards, following the same pattern as for lapis lazuli before the civilization ended. There was now an element of control by 2nd millennia palatial centers, such as that of Mari, located in West Syria, which had become the market for exotic goods and important commodities moving from east to west, and tin was one such commodity. Two collections of cuneiform texts of Mari, the Mari tablets, dated to the 19th and 18th centuries BCE, have references to the tin trade, which documents the trade moving exclusively from east to west. Arriving in Mesopotamia from India, tin would then have been transshipped up the Euphrates River to Mari, where tin was traded further west to sites in Syria, and then on to the Aegean. Tin is a commodity that, if used to make bronze, is not reusable and was also always sought after throughout the whole of the Bronze Age. For Mari and then possibly Ugarit and other Assyrian ports, it was sold to traders from, amongst other, Kaftor, which is now identified as Minoan Crete, characterized by the finding and the sites of imported Minoan pottery dated mostly to the Middle Bronze Age of around 1900 BC. One tin inventory at Mari lists the sites to which tin was distributed, and another inventory mentions the route by which Mari received tin from the east by way of the town of Shuna, located in Mesopotamia on the river Tigris, with easy access to the trade routes from India. By around 1750 BC, Crete was now establishing a relationship with North Syria that included Ugarit, Byblos, and Qatna, which linked the river traffic of the Euphrates with the coast of the Mediterranean. The major factor for this development was their growing bronze industry and the demand for tin. Later in the second millennia BCE, there is further evidence of tin ingots being traded in the Eastern Mediterranean, with a possible destination of the palaces and workshops of the Mycenaeans on the Greek mainland. Within the cargoes of shipwrecks of the period can be found tin ingots. One such example is the Uluburun shipwreck, dated to 1300 BC, found on the south coast of Turkey, which carried approximately 40 tin ingots supplied from the Syria's coast, which were approximately 1 metric ton in total weight. Many of the ingots were in the oxide form, as similarly used for copper, although there were a few that were in other forms, such as bun and rectangular slabs. These ingots were seemingly cut into smaller pieces like this, before loading and possibly represent an assemblage that was cut up to distribute and use. It is likely that the ingots were cast at sites east of Mesopotamia, possibly Afghanistan or Central Asia, where the ore was first produced. Now I turn to my final category, the importation of non-perishable organic commodities. A few organic commodities in use in the Aegean throughout the Bronze Age are believed to have had Indian origins. There are herbs such as sweet rush or ginger grass, identified by John Chadwick from the Linear B tablets from Knossos and Mycenae. Chadwick believed that some of them originate in India, where they are indigenous to the northwest, being carried along the same trade routes as the earlier periods through the Gulf and the Syrian coast, and locally cultivated. A particular example of a herb that is believed originated in India and found its way to the Aegean from the Near East was cardamom, found in a Linear B tablet from Mycenae, and another plant that is thought originated in India is sesame. It's understood to be native to India and was likely exported starting in the 4th millennium BC, and like other plants, subsequently cultivated locally. Finally, it has been suggested that it's possible to trace the condiment cinnamon and black pepper so obliquously in use throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, the Bronze Age, and later to an Indian origin. Now, evidence of very long-distance trade in spices involving India can be found at the site of Turka or Tel Ashara, located on the banks of the Middle Euphrates in southern Syria and dated to around 1700 BCE, where in the house of Huzarum, kernels of cloves have been found in a kitchen jar. This spice was not known to the Near East and the West much before the Romans, and more significantly, it is now known to originate in the Meluḥħa Islands, now part of modern Indonesia, having been imported through India, like the other spices featured here. And there is no reason to why it could have not, and some of it could not have ended up in the Aegean. Although there are no archaeological remains of wood, we have evidence that Indian sandalwood will have been exported from India to the Near East, and some of the timber may have also found its way further west. It's mentioned in the Mesopotamian records as having come from India. We are reminded of the remarks of Cyprian Broodbank made some years ago that for the early Bronze Age, and I quote, "It cannot of course be denied that over a period of some 500 years, a few Aegean canoes might have paddled far into the sunrise, or occasionally Eastern traders entered the Aegean, giving that by this time Sumerian ships were ranging as far as Oman and the Indus. And that's the depictions of Indus ships. What we allow ourselves is to have a vision of seafarers and caravan drovers from different parts of the Near East and India, starting in the latter part of the 3rd millennium BC, to develop a prosperous trade through Mesopotamian and Gulf cities and seaports, facilitating objects and commodities to make their way westwards by the time of the early and middle Bronze Ages in the Aegean. Later, by the time that the Minoans on Crete and subsequently the Mycenaeans were building their first palaces, the greatness of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro will have, with their economy and expansive trade links, were beginning to decline or long gone. However, trade links with the Near East and India continued at a time of the expansion of Minoan seafaring, and more systematic contact with the Near East began when Minoan seafarers first came readily into contact with North Syrian ports. Trade expeditions were commissioned by Aegean palace administrations, which needed the components of bronze, the copper coming from Cyprus, and the tin from further east from India. Along the route, the ships and caravans would have picked up random and exotic items, such as beads and other objects, to sweeten the heavy bartering that would have occurred at every port of call. As for later Indian imports into the late Bronze Age, whilst the last remnants of post-urban late Harappan society had by all accounts now largely disappeared, there is evidence that trade in a few commodities will have continued, and this offers witness to Mesopotamian and Syrian trade and influence in the 2nd millennium BCE, with links that would endure to the end of the Bronze Age in 1100 BC, when it all came to an end. However, this says nothing much about the Aegean, as they were largely only on the receiving ends of these contacts. What we find puzzling, however, is that there is no evidence of any object originating west of Mesopotamia finding its way into the Indus civilization. The export of objects and mainly commodities was all one way, and the trade in particular of tin, lapis lazuli, and possibly gold was one of the principal sources of their wealth and was not for exchange. We're reminded, of course, that the echo of the Indus civilization was known to the Greco-Roman world, particularly 2,000 years later. In AD 23, in his Geographica, Strabo wrote, when Aristobulus was sent upon certain missions to India, he saw a country of more than 1,000 cities, together with villages that had been deserted because a great river had abandoned its proper bed. That's the River Gaga. This is a short epitaph to a great and important civilization, which I believe the prehistoric Aegean was in contact, probably unknowingly, and certainly at an extreme long distance. I shall now very briefly look in the short time left to me at the period between the Bronze Age and the time that Alexander the Great entered what is now modern South Asia. In doing so, I want to concentrate on one particular writer on pre-Alexandrian India, namely Herodotus of Halicarnassus, who lived from 484 to 425 BCE. In his histories, it's the first to describe real contact of mainland Greeks with India, describing Indian soldiers amongst the ranks of the Persian army that invaded Greece in 490 BCE and were defeated at Marathon. He describes their strange cotton clothing, cane bows, and arrowheads, with some on horseback and some in chariots drawn by wild asses. Compared to his descriptions of Persia and Egypt, his writings on India in Book 3 are a mixture of strange and romantic ideas of India, which he helped to spread, including Indian myths. Although it's probably safe to assume that he never probably visited India, he was an indefatigable collector of anecdotes from many sources. He knew that India embraced diverse population groups of wildly varying physical appearance, customs, and languages. However, he took it too far, and he was not above describing strange and fantastic people found in India. These are drawings based upon his descriptions. This is for what he is best known. One of the most interesting and most well-known descriptions of Herodotus, likely later known to Alexander and all those who look for wealth in India, is that gold is produced in the Indian desert by fierce ants larger than foxes. This appears at first sight to be an utter fantasy, but one explanation is that it's related to the burrowing activities of the rodent family, and one of the rodent family, the Himalayan marmot. That's the suggestive ant, and that's the marmot. This rodent habits the land of giants of Jammu and Kashmir. It is believed that they may have thrown up gold-bearing earth as they burrowed, which was then exploited by the local population. Herodotus also recognizes the cotton plant for the first time and the fabric it produces. Quote, "There are trees which grow wild there. The fruit thereof is a wool exceeding in beauty and goodness that of sheep. The natives make their clothes of this tree wool. The Greeks would not have known about cotton before, unless worn by an Indian or Persian with whom they came into contact." Overall, Herodotus emphasizes the country's wealth in gold, not unsurprising as many of the early traders sought an inroad into India's great wealth. Indian birds and beasts he regards as much bigger than those existing elsewhere, except for horses. However, Herodotus' notion of geography were understandably inaccurate. For instance, his belief that the Indus flows eastwards, perhaps he mixed it up with the Ganges, and that India constitutes the most easterly inhabited region of Asia, with only desert wastes beyond the Punjab. Interestingly, nothing in his writings gives the impression that India possessed much in the way of civilization, let alone the philosophic and religious eminence for which it became noted only 100 years later, after Alexander had entered India. And I'll finish off, if I may, with advertising the book, which we're here for this evening, Crossing Continents, published by Oxbow Books of Oxford, in which everything I've said this evening is contained in detail and reference. And the section on post-Bronze Age is much, much fuller. And I'd like to finally express my thanks to the following, who have made my research over the last few years possible. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think we'll take a few questions, Professor Arnott. Can you hear me all right?
Oh, of course.
Yes.
Right. Delighted to answer any questions.
Hi, thank you very much. Fascinating and some beautiful objects there. I just wanted to ask what actually went back in the ships and how the people in the Aegean.
Alison, I'm getting feedback. I can't hear you very easily.
All right. Sorry, is that better now? Hello.
That's much better.
Is that better?
Hello. How's that? No?
That's a bit better, yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to ask what went back to the Indus area in the ships. I can, it doesn't sound, you said, as if any objects or there's much evidence of goods coming back, but also how, given that the gold was going from India to the Aegean, how did people actually pay for these objects? They weren't, for example, an area full of diamonds or anything like that. What was the currency going back?
That's a very, very good question. And I thought about this one. There is no evidence anywhere in the Indus civilization of even a single object that might have originated further westwards than Mesopotamia. There are Mesopotamian seals, one at Lothal particularly, but not that many. And I've often wondered what, as you say quite correctly, you have in the boats that go from India up through the Gulf, up through to the Great Zilman and Megan, and then into the ports of southern Mesopotamia. They must have brought something back. My only thoughts on this matter was, in fact, that they probably brought back either organic materials like food that was grown in Mesopotamia, or animals, or even slaves, possibly. I mean, there's no evidence of slave society, but it's a speculation. I mean, you're right. I mean, you're absolutely right. There wasn't going to be empty ships sailing from Mesopotamia down through the Gulf again. But it completely eludes me and others who have looked into this that what these ships might have contained. The texts only talk about going one way. Whether in fact there is anything ever, one day, when they decipher the Indus script, there's some reference there to the receipt of materials. I don't know. But again, if you look at the Indus, Indus script, it's unlikely because of the nature of it to be that descriptive of things like economic things like you get in both in the Aegean and in the Abbey and in Mesopotamia with the cuneiform tablets. So the answer to that one is basically, I'll sum it up by saying, I haven't a clue.
Thank you.
and we're working on it.
Right. I was just going to say to anyone who's listening in on Zoom, if you want to ask questions, you can post them on the chat and I'll pick them up at this end. But we have another question here.
Thank you, Robert. I was very interested, if I understand correctly, you suggest that there's commercial exchange, but not cultural exchange, certainly in the early period. I'd always thought it was axiomatic that commercial exchange led to cultural exchange. And if it didn't in this case, was there some system of relay? Do we have small packages traveling from point to point and an exchange of people taking them? Do you have any sense of what the mechanism was for the passage of these goods?
No. Yes. I mean, there is some suggestion. One or two scholars have suggested there is cultural contact in iconography, particularly in pottery, between Mesopotamia and in the Indus. I mean, I've concentrated my talk and my book on the Aegean, but any suggestion that there's any cultural contact between the Aegean and India, I think is not possible. But certainly between Mesopotamia and Aegean, you've got seals, you've got some pottery, you've got evidence in some of the Mesopotamian texts of a community, of an Indus community in Mesopotamia, and one of the texts talks about this person who is a translator between the language of the Indus civilization and the local language that they were speaking, probably Akkadian. So there must have been some form of cultural contact between the two. But again, the biggest obstacle we have in the Indus is, in fact, that there is no evidence textually of anything. One day, maybe when the colleagues in Helsinki Poplar and his crew and their computers may one day come up with a solution to the decipherment. I'm looking forward to that very much. But again, if you look at the script, particularly on seals and metal plates and things like that, it's unlikely to have been particularly exciting. It might just say this belongs to or something. So no, I mean, yes, there was cultural exchange, but it's difficult to pinpoint. One of the things that my colleague of mine actually in the University of Pennsylvania, and I hope she's been working on it and published, is that there may be some iconographical evidence of importation of some sort of symbols from the Aegean from India into the Aegean. She's worked on a series of frescoes from Thera in the Cyclades, which depict animals which cannot have come from anywhere other than India. So if you look at the possibility of that would mean either animals were traded or were the pets, maybe, who knows, of traders, or in fact the iconography was exchanged, which I think perhaps fits more into what you're saying. Is certainly something that she's working on at the moment, and in fact I'll advertise it now. I'm organising a conference at Oxford University in December. We've got people coming from around the world to discuss the issues of the relationship between the Aegean and India, and some of these questions you've posed and Alison has posed are high on the agenda.
Thank you.
Derek, would you like to?
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. It's a comment on the question. I was surprised that you put as much emphasis as you did on the Aegean and Greece, because fascinating as these been to Europeans since 19th century Greek independence. Greek civilization itself started off in Anatolia and really only got going in the first millennium BC. So I would have thought the more interesting extent of trade and interconnection in much of the period you were talking about could have been expected to be with Mesopotamia and Anatolia. And that would actually have been the formative shape that probably led on to other things in the next period.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, some of the ideas you're just referring to are in fact in the book. I mean, I've only this evening I've just done one or two extracts from the book. The book's in the library. I've presented a copy to the Society Library. So if any of you want to have a read of it in the library, you can do so. But one of my colleagues and I from Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Oxford are determined to take this one stage further. The reason we selected the Aegean was, well, for me anyway, it was because I was working in the Aegean, went to India on, for something completely different, and sort of, dare I say, fell in love with Indian archaeology while I was there, and felt that, wonder if there's any connection. You knew one or two things. You'd read one or two articles such as that really depressed you, like bull leaping and the Kernoi, but you then realize that there are other things. And then my colleague from the University of Salzburg started finding stuff at his site on the Aegean, and then of course the whole thing then develops, because one of the things that people have realized working in the Aegean, and it must work for other societies as well, is that they didn't realize that they had Indian objects on their sites because they had no knowledge of Indian archaeology. And when I started explaining to them, you've got agate beads there. You've got carnelian beads there, and these originate from India. Only then it begins to, everybody's starting to sort of go and rush and search in the little boxes in their storerooms of their sites to see what they've got. And stuff's coming up all the time. And that's what's particularly exciting about this. Nobody had the knowledge. I got to know the material from the Indus by going to India, looking in the museums, talking to Indian archaeologists, reading books, reading the original excavation report, particularly that by Sir John Marshall, and then realized, some of the stuff is in the Aegean. Has always been the Aegean, but it's always been in that category of we really don't know where this is coming from. Probably the Near East or something, and you get that, and you get that. I should say actually, however, and I want to point this out, and I haven't done hitherto. On the beginning of the book, I actually dedicate the book to the memory of Sir John Marshall, who was the one announced the discovery of the civilization, Indus Civilization, not yet 100 years ago. It's that new in many respects, in September 1924. And he started his life working on Crete with Sir Arthur Evans, and then got snatched by Lord Curzon to be the head of archaeology in India, and became a Harappan. So I'd like to think, perhaps, arrogantly, I don't know, I'd like to think that I stead in his footsteps. I've dug on Crete, my first digs were on Crete, and now I'm working in India. I have a lot of respect for that man. He wrote beautifully, and he wasn't wrong.
Well, thank you. You're doing great work in drawing up the ancient world, which clearly needs to be done.
Peter.
Yes, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. As a modern historian, I'm always struck by the complexity of these contexts in the ancient world, which are apparent all the time and have been obviously unknown, as you say, for a very long time. The questions in my mind were actually the questions already asked. And I wondered whether there was, in addition to those questions, any evidence in the archaeology, of which I'm ignorant, which would explain the degree to which Harappan civilization was organized around or was geared towards this degree of trade and exchange that you have evidence for. I mean, also, of course, it's obvious that leave aside Herodotus, this must have done something to people's view of themselves and of the world, and it must have done something to the way in which societies were organized. Yeah. And I wonder what the evidence. Obviously, there's no evidence of the ideas because we haven't got the script deciphered, and probably won't be when we do. But is there other evidence of some sort of reaction, some sort of pattern of behaviour which would tie in with these exchanges?
No, difficult one. I mean, the reasons for the demise of the Indus civilization are numerous. I mean, most people now, and I think rightly, would centre it around some major, almost existential events that happened climatically in about 2000 BC. You've got the drying up of the Gagahara River, which a huge number of the sites are in fact are located, and there's the movement eastwards into the Ganges Valley, into the Ganges Valley, and you've also got the ending quite rapidly of Mohenjo-daro. You've got evidence at Harappa, which lasts a lot longer, the late Harappan phase, and you've got some a cemetery there which shows that content. And of course, you've got the argument, I'm not going to go in this evening because it's a minefield, is this question is when did the Indo-Europeans arrive in India? I don't believe they were there to conquer. I think they came much, much after. You've got the whole element of the ending of a civilization and the effects of that climatic change, you'll find all over in the Aegean and the Near East and things like that. And you fact at the time you've got in the 200-300 years after that, you've got the ending of trade, substantial ending of trade. That is, that the trading tins continues. But that's probably done through Iran, and of course, I believe that the Indus civilization concentrated, put too many eggs in one basket in respect that their wealth was substantially based on trade with the Near East, and when that was affected, or they could no longer substantiate producing the materials, because don't forget they were being 700, 800, 900 miles to the north of the source, and they were bringing them down to very treacherous territory in the southern Hindu Kush River, southern Hindu Kush Mountains. That if that finished, then the source of their wealth would have dried up. So I think partly trade had something to do with it. And there's a number of people, the late Greg Postle actually wrote about this, that the ending of the trade did in fact have a serious demoralizing effect on the Harappans, which would have that combined with all the other factors would have in fact enhanced the possibility of the ending of that civilization. And you don't really get much problem. I mean, he suggests that there was still an export in cotton cloth over the next 1,000 years, but not until you get the Persians coming into the Punjab, and the contact starting really then to get the re-establishment of forms of trade. There was that big long period when it just didn't happen, and would have created economic problems and poverty. That was a long-winded way of saying I agree.
Right. Well, I don't think we have any more questions, so I think we'll finish there, if that's all right with you. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.